Michael Frayn has been quietly scaring the thermal underwear off his generation of writers since he first proved how much he had to burn with his Guardian column in the early 1960s. From Cambridge and national service, he seemed to arrive at the peak of Fleet Street by rocket. After a detour into television, he became such a permanent force in the theatre that by now a new Frayn play seems always ready to succeed another, and its subject will illuminate a whole modern historical area when it isn't a knockdown, drag-out farce. Can an ordinary man live with the uncertainty of quantum mechanics? Can a physicist retain his trousers? Such questions intermingle also in his novels, which arrive either between or simultaneously with the plays. At least 3 of the novels I consider to be modern classics, but I wouldn't dream of specifying which, since I've always found him a bit scary, partly because he doesn't babble. He thinks before he talks. Hardly anybody does that. Let me take you back, and I'm taking myself back to when I first read you when I got to England in the 60s, and you were running your miscellany column in The Guardian, and you had all these characters going. Christopher Smooth, Rollo Swavely, how do you pronounce
Swavely,
it?
Rollo Swavely.
What was Rollo Swavely? Was he in PR?
He was PR.
And Christopher Smooth?
Christopher Smooth, he was the Minister of Chance and Speculation.
And
it was a Conservative government in those days.
Yeah, but they sort of won, didn't they? They're in the Labour Party now.
Possibly.
Who was the teenage satirist? There was a teenage satirist.
Yeah, I had forgotten him. I think he was called Ken Knocker.
Ken Knocker. Well, he's the Mayor of London.
Where did all that satire come from? I think I was one of the first in the business, but then my satire was very gentle. And I got overtaken by things like That Was the Week That Was and Private Eye and so forth, which were much more savage. And suddenly everyone was doing satire. I felt a bit sour about it, because it's okay if you're the one person in the market selling oranges or selling satire or whatever, but if everyone's doing it, it's not so good. I think in my case, one of the sources was having done national service, and everyone got very bolshy on national service. And I was with a lot of people learning Russian, but they were all rather bright people, and they got to be, we developed a kind of mythology about the army. And we had lots of fictitious characters who were intended to mock the discipline of the army. And one of the people on my course was Alan Bennett. And we used to write stuff together for shows. And he did his priest, who's his clergyman with the special greasy clergy voice.
Oh, the one that he put in Beyond the Fringe.
Beyond the Fringe, yes.
My brother
he gave
Esau is a hairy man and I am a smooth man.
Yeah. But I think we kind of developed this bolshy attitude between us in the army, and that kind of spilled over into life afterwards.
You did a lot of television. Now, where did all that go? It was great stuff. I watched it all, but there's no way of keeping it, was there?
Well, I did a lot of what the papers say, which was inherently ephemeral.
You couldn't keep it. No. It was transmitted and it was gone.
On tape. But the films, the things about cities were all on film. Yeah. So they're all, I hope, sitting in an archive somewhere. But you can never get them out of the BBC. The BBC got their hands.
Don't I know it? I made 30 of them myself, and they're not mine.
I know.
They belong to whoever put up the money, which wasn't me. One of the cities you talked about was Vienna, and I simply loved that show. And because you love Vienna, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we started the very first one we did with Berlin, and I think Berlin is possibly my favourite city in the world. Yeah. Why? Because it challenges the imagination. It's very difficult to make sense of it, particularly then, before the rebuilding started, because so much of the city had been destroyed. And you thought, why is it here? Stuck here, surrounded by a wall in the middle of East Germany with no natural hinterland at all.
No place for a city, is it? Yeah.
It certainly wasn't a place for a city at all. But so you had to keep thinking historically, what was it like before it got destroyed, before they built the wall, when Germany was unified? Why was there a city here? Because it was a capital, and it was no longer a capital.
Anyway, you did Berlin, and then Vienna was waiting for you. This one thrilled me because you had this idea of all these famous people in Vienna who kind of knew each other. It takes a village.
Well, we thought Vienna has apparently changed very little, not like Berlin. So we thought we'd just assume we were back in the turn of the century, 1900, and we were filming in 1900. So that was the trope conceit we did that on.
In the days when Alma Mahler was, every famous man in Vienna was sleeping with her and everyone knew everyone. I think you said somewhere in the movie that the city was just the right size.
Yeah, yes, I guess it was. And it was the centre of this huge collapsing empire, I mean, falling to pieces around itself.
There's a strain about Arcadia that goes all through your work. You did a documentary about where you came from. It was one of the Metroland suburbs, and forgive me when the name's gone right out of my mind.
Well, it wasn't Metroland. Metroland was along the line of the Metropolitan Railway going northwest, and I was brought up in the southern suburbs of London.
It was like Metroland going the other way.
Absolutely.
What was the name?
Southern Railway. It was Ewell. Next to Epsom. Yeah. And for years, when I was a child, I was just embarrassed by the word Ewell, and I couldn't bring myself to tell people I came from Ewell. There's just something embarrassing.
Why? Because it was nowhere, or
well, because when you're an adolescent, you're embarrassed by everything about your background. You're embarrassed by your parents. You're embarrassed by.
Well, you should have been dead of asbestos poisoning 50 years ago. Didn't you? Wasn't there asbestos in your life when you were?
Yes, my father sold asbestos and used to bring the samples home and give them to me to make sheds and things with, and I saw them up, and the air was full of asbestos.
You cut up asbestos when you were a kid.
And my sister died of mesothelioma.
That was connected?
Well, probably. She couldn't think of any other.
Do forgive me. I thought I was joking.
No. But it catches up with you after a long time. It can literally take 40 years to develop.
And he was selling.
He was selling it. Yeah.
I think Clive said somewhere that the whole secret of that whole generation of humorists, they're all sons of salesmen.
Yeah, a brilliant thing to say. I hadn't thought of that, but it's quite true about a lot of humorous writers. Their fathers, in one way or another, are salesmen. Mine was odd sort of salesman because he was deaf, very deaf. And one of the ways he dealt with it, of having to go and see clients all day and talk to them and not be able to hear what they were saying, was make jokes all the time. So he kept the conversational initiative. And all the other people had to do was nod and laugh and say yes and so forth, and he didn't have to hear what they were saying.
There are people on TV who do that now.
Absolutely. But I think
good
maybe,
training, huh?
well, maybe I caught some of that off him. Not that I do it in conversation, but as a strategy in life.
The way that you portrayed Ewell, and the reason it reminded me of Betjeman was it was a kind of dreamland. It was an ideal place for the imagination to run riot because not much else was happening. One of the themes in your work is the imagination of the young. In your book Spies, you've got a kid who really thinks that his friend's mother is a German spy. And these beliefs, these perceptions rule the young, and they seem to flourish in these quiet areas.
Well, I think they rule everyone in one way or another. We've all got stories we tell about the world. We make sense of the world in terms of the stories. It's just that it's easier for adults to see what's happening when it's going on in young people, because you're never aware of your own story. You think it's the truth. But when you look at the stories children tell, they're obviously stories. But it's true about the suburbs leaving a certain amount of room for the imagination, particularly when I grew up, because it was the middle of the Second World War. And for a start, there were a lot of bomb sites where you could play, and that was neutral territory for children to meet. You didn't have to go to each other's houses. And partly because there was no traffic on the roads, and no psychopaths around because they were all in the army killing somebody else. So our parents let us run
wild.
Yeah, we went more or less where we liked.
Tell me about the tyranny of the fortunate. It's a phrase of yours that popped up quite early on, and I immediately heard that click that we hear when we know that something big is happening. So yes, that's the thing. That's the centre of politics. You have to try to do what you can to guard us all against the tyranny of the fortunate, because in a free society, the fortunate will be perceived as tyrants and might even act that way unless they keep their conscience alert. Tell me where that came from. When did you spot it?
Well, I think it's just obvious that.
There's a lot of people it's not obvious to.
Really? Well, yeah.
Well, practically every free market ideologist to start with. Can we go on?
Well, no, but they're all trying to make people fortunate, trying to increase their fortune. It just seems to me that one of the things that society ought to do is not try and destroy that, but put a few brakes on it and make life a little more tolerable for other people. I mean, it does seem to me that that a sense of competition is absolutely inherent in people in all Western societies. I don't know about tribal societies, and everyone has some idea of where they are in a particular pecking order. And I think the best hope of making society more tolerable is to make sure there are a lot of different pecking orders, a lot of different ways in which people can succeed and fail. So even if you're failing in one way, there's a chance you may be succeeding in another. And of course, people take that into their own hands, and people who feel they're not being successful in orthodox terms in society join gangs, turn to crime and so forth, and find another way of succeeding.
It's something I try to say when I'm asked questions along these lines in Australia, that Australia bids fair to being the world's most advanced social democracy because it consists almost entirely of elites. Yeah, you're a member of an elite if you're an Australian citizen, and the nice thing about Australia is you can be an elite plumber.
Right.
And nobody questions your position.
Yeah.
And the Prime Minister will be glad to meet you. That's what you're after, I think.
Well, sure, and Australia is a very congenial place to be. It's one of my favourite places. But of course there is a great deprived group in Australian society. We don't need to remind ourselves.
Yeah, well, we do need to remind ourselves, and there's no danger of forgetting it, incidentally, because there's a vast industry of commentary devoted to reminding you constantly.
Yes.
To the point where there are quite a few Aborigines who simply like a little bit less attention, more justice and less publicity.
That's right.
I should be talking generally about the way you've shaped your career. Noises Off, was that your first
well, that
show?
was by far the biggest one, but I had successful plays before then.
But it was fast throughout, and it was trousers down, door opening,
Yes.
fast and hard to do.
Very, very hard to do because it's interlocking farce, front stage and backstage, and then before the event and after the event. So anything you change anywhere changes everything else.
But Sweet Dreams is really my favourite because it's talking about the ideal city, which is one of your themes. And this time the ideal city is heaven. And your heaven is what the world would be like if it was just and fair. You have this idea that ideally, of course, all the seas would be shallow so no one could drown and so on. Everything is adapted to the reasonable life. And God is someone pretty much like you and not wearing quite as good a suit, in fact.
So he doesn't make you feel ill at ease.
Somewhere in this book there's a melancholy. You rather hope that this will never come about. There's boredom in it, if you get me.
Well, the intention behind the book was really to suggest that utopias don't quite work, that all projections of societies where everything is perfect and everyone can be happy, which is an idea that seizes people's imagination over and over again in human history. The only way to make them work is to actually take the logical pins out. So the picture of the heaven in the book is a place which is not bound by the rules of logic, not bound by the rules of time, not bound by any kind of normal causality. And that's the only way you can make it work so everyone is having a good time there.
It's a terrific book, and there is that melancholy in it. There was melancholy in another early novel of yours, and you've got to forgive me because the name you've done so much, the name of the novel's gone right out of my mind, but the novel hasn't. It more or less forecasts the virtual future. It forecasts from the past the way that we're going to live, and in some ways we're living now. When lovers are never really together except through TV screens and so on. You know the novel I'm talking about.
Yes, A Very Private Life.
Very Private Life.
Yes.
Now that book is a very scary book. There's a lot that you see coming because technology is going to make possible a sort of universal alienation.
Well, I wrote that after a long stay in America. And it seemed to me that American society was beginning to go a bit in that direction.
There are parts of Los Angeles that definitely
absolutely,
have.
yes. I was particularly struck by Phoenix, Arizona, walking around Phoenix, and there's no life, as in Los Angeles, there's no life on the streets. It's all inside in the houses. And if you're outside the houses, you are nowhere and nobody. You're just a potential housebreaker going to be picked up by the police. So that was the takeoff point. But it's true, as technology has improved, there's less and less reason for travelling around in the open air and travelling on unreliable trains and so forth. It's much simpler and easier to use electronic.
Minimise human contact.
Yeah, and present a virtual image of yourself to the other person. They present a virtual image of themselves to you.
You can even convince yourself that you're being more human than there used to be. I write 100 emails where once I wrote 10 letters.
Yes.
And I convince myself I'm actually being quite community busy, but it's not true because I'm shut in. Yeah.
Well, inside, yes, it's like all these dystopias. It's a projection beyond what anyone could actually reasonably forecast.
The sense of community, the thing that is not there in Phoenix, Arizona, you did find in Vienna, and it's one of the great things about democracy is the sense that a big city can be a small town in that way. But there was a joker in the pack, and that was the Nazis, and that's what I want to bring you to, because it's the role that evil plays. The role that evil has played in what we think of as European history, by which we mean the continent always, and hasn't to the same extent played in Britain, but it gets into your work. It was already there waiting to come out in Vienna, because the old Vienna, it still looks the way it used to do, but it was simply destroyed by the Nazis. It became a ghost town. And eventually you wrote a play which is... Copenhagen is about the spectre of a Nazi A-bomb.
Well, go back to the Nazis. The Nazis are in the wings of several things I've written. There's in the film about Berlin, the film about Vienna, we know the Nazis are on the way.
Well, they were in the woodwork of Vienna, weren't they, waiting to come out? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. But I don't go into the Nazi period at all. And in a play I wrote called Democracy, it's set in Germany after the Second World War, and it's about Germany's recovery from Nazism. Nazism absolutely captures the imagination of lots of nice, decent, democratic, peace-loving people who wouldn't hurt a fly, but somehow the sheer effrontery of Nazism, the sheer abandonment of all the normal standards we take for granted in life, somehow seizes people's imagination like a horror movie. It doesn't quite seize mine. I mean, I see the interest, but I'm not actually personally interested in it. And in the case of Copenhagen, what's at issue is whether Heisenberg was sympathized with the Nazis. No one thinks he was a Nazi, but a lot of people think he was sympathetic to the Nazis and was too ready to serve the Nazi regime, or whether he had inward reservations about it, which made him unconsciously unable to see the mathematics he needed to do to solve the problem of atomic weapons.
I want you to continue that line of thought. I just want to raise the possibility or the question of whether just staying there wasn't an indication that you were sympathetic to the Nazis. If he had been a Jew, of course, the problem would have been solved for him. He would have had to go or die. But since he was a Gentile, he could stay. But surely the mere fact of staying and wanting to go on functioning within the German academic system was in a way, to a considerable extent, an endorsement of Nazism. I mean, it wasn't as if he didn't understand it.
Well, it's certainly the view that a lot of people take. But if you think, very, very few Gentile Germans who were not politically opposed to Nazis, weren't communists or social democrats, went into exile. There were some notable exceptions, like another physicist, Schrödinger. But the whole population of Germany could not have emigrated. It's true that Heisenberg could. He was extremely distinguished,
well-connected abroad,
international reputation, and offers of very good jobs in America. What he said himself and how to judge this, I don't know, is that he thought Nazism was a disaster for German science, as it had been, and he wanted to be there when Nazism went to pick up the pieces, which indeed he did. The British put him in charge of German science in the British zone of occupation, and he did indeed recover German science after the war. I would think his motives, like most people's motives for most complicated things in life, were mixed. Yeah. He certainly told somebody that he couldn't bear to leave Germany, it was his homeland. He told somebody else that he wanted to preserve tenure, which is not such a wonderful...
You don't think he wanted to build a bomb just to see if it would work? Our boys were listening, our GCHQ boys were actually listening to him at the end of the war, weren't they? They had all the...
Yes. I don't think everything about the known records suggests that he had very little eagerness to build a weapon. Well, he was very eager to understand fission, and he was extremely eager to build a reactor. And the moral problem arose for him, if there was a moral problem, which is disputed, when he realized, or when other people realized, that if they could get the reactor going, it would produce plutonium, which would be an abundant source of fissile material to replace the U-235 that they couldn't actually, they found extremely difficult to separate.
So they could make a bomb with it.
So if they could get the reactor going, then that would lead the way to weapons.
It brings us to the problem of our bomb, not their bomb. One of the reasons we built our bomb, by we I mean the British and the Americans, because it was a British invention as well as an American one. One of the reasons we built it, we thought the Germans were. It was a very good reason, as far as I can see. But it brings the question of what we did with our bomb. Because after the invasion of Europe in 1944, one of the first things that the Allies did was find out if the German bomb had gone anywhere. They found out that it hadn't. It could be said that in that case, we could have called the whole thing off, but instead we finished building the bomb and dropped it on Japan. Now, I've got a view on that, but I'd like to know yours about our bomb.
I think it's extremely difficult to project oneself back into that decision, whether to use it or not. And I'm no expert on the business of the use of the bomb in Japan, but I know part of the problem was that I think they only had 2 weapons available.
Yes.
And if they didn't manage to secure the effect they wanted, let's just say Japanese surrender, with those 2 weapons, they were dished for quite a long time.
That was Oppenheimer's argument. It was Oppenheimer himself
Yes,
who said, we've got to drop it on a city. There's no point making a demonstration with it. They might think it's a trick.
Yeah.
If you want to catch the Emperor's attention, you've got to do something unspeakable. Yeah. There's a logic to it.
Yeah.
But to accept that logic, you have to agree that continuing the war would have been unthinkable, which is my view. My father was a prisoner in Japan.
Yes, I know. No.
My mother wanted him home.
Yes.
There were a lot of people like that.
Yes, and there's somebody else I know who was a prisoner who said his life is still alive now, and he survived because of that. Because the bombs were dropped.
Yeah, let's talk about the other thing that Heisenberg had in his pocket. He never had the atomic bomb in his pocket. He did have uncertainty in his pocket, the uncertainty principle. We're getting into a realm here where very few viewers can follow, because I can't follow, and I'm not so sure you can follow the mathematics.
Well, Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said anyone who thinks he can understand quantum mechanics doesn't understand quantum mechanics.
And Feynman was the greatest lecturer on the subject there ever was, and a real thriller. Yeah. But to what extent does uncertainty actually influence your thinking? Because you've published a book on philosophy now, and I think everything you've written is philosophical. I think all good writing is philosophical anyway. But you've bravely forged into philosophical waters where the academic philosophers could shoot at you. And one of the things you're saying is that an awful lot depends on our agreed perceptions about whether things are actually there, whether the universe is big, for example. Without us to say it's big, is it big?
Is it anything? Yes. Is it anything?
Well, some would say, well, Frayn is crazy. Of course it is.
Well, what I'm arguing in the book, The Human Touch, is that there is a paradox. That on the one hand, plainly, we're irrelevant. The universe was here a long time before we were. It'll be here a long time after we are gone.
I knew that when I was tiny. And it's a big difference between people, isn't it?
Right.
Because some people just can't imagine that the universe is there for any other reason except for them.
Well, but then on the other side
Many
of the
of them are
paradox,
actors.
the other side of the paradox is if no human beings to say it's large and to measure it and talk about it in words, what is the universe? I mean, it isn't, in a sense, it isn't anything.
I saw a professional philosopher chasing you last week. I think it was in the London Review of Books. He was saying Frayn is crazy. If we weren't here, the universe would still be big. But all he can do is assert it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And I entirely agree with him. It would be here, and we all know that's true. But on the other hand, what would be here? What would be here?
Well, Dr. Johnson, when he was refuting Bishop Berkeley was saying that this table is a cloudy substance. And Johnson said, well, I refute it thus and keep the rock.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't quite refute it, does it? Because the table is a cloudy substance.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, all science depends on measurement, all physics. What is measurement? Measurement is a comparison of one thing with another thing. There aren't any comparisons sitting out there in the world. Comparisons are something we make. And we can make true comparisons, we can make false comparisons, accurate comparisons, less accurate comparisons. But until somebody says this shoe is longer than this hand, that is not a part of the universe. But what is part of the universe is someone making that comparison.
Or you can make a play out of it. Has it occurred to you that it would never, ever have occurred to Sir Arthur Wing Pinero or even Oscar Wilde to make a play out of science?
Science is an absolutely central part, has become an absolutely central part of the way we look at the world. It's taken a long time. It didn't really, science in the modern sense didn't really take off until the 17th century. But by the time we got to the 19th century, it had become absolutely central to human thought. And in the 20th century, it became absolutely dominant. I think in some ways too dominant. I think the physical sciences have had such huge success that people have tried to adapt other methods of thought, ways of describing human behavior, for instance, to the sciences, not very successfully because they're not really susceptible of being treated as physical sciences.
What's gone wrong with so-called cultural studies, actually, studying to treat poetry as a mechanical construction. It isn't. It's the most complicated thing in the world, but it's not mathematical.
Absolutely, yes.
I think you've got an unfair share of a very, very rare characteristic, and that is you are the sane guy who can imagine desperation. Usually the people who can imagine desperation are nutty as fruitcakes. I mean,
yeah. Well,
is it insulting you to call you essentially normal?
I get desperate at times. We all feel desperate at times, don't we? When I first began to write farces, serious interviewers would always say to me, why do you write farces? Why don't you write about life as it really is? And I couldn't imagine what their lives must be like. Certainly not like mine.
Well, I have to agree with that, and I have to say thank you. Let's do this again.
Thanks.